Welcome everybody to the webinar. If you're just joining us, we're just about to get started. Just a few administration items before we get started. All attendees are muted just to reduce background noise. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can use the Q&A panel and we'll be sure to answer those at the end, or we may be able to reply right then. And to kick things off, I'm going to hand things off to our moderator, Sharon.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the LA Metro RideCo webinar. My name is Sharon Feigon, and I'm the founder of the Shared Use Mobility Center, and I will be the moderator today. The Shared Use Mobility Center is a public interest organization dedicated to creating a multimodal transportation system for all. And we do this by working to scale up innovative mobility projects such as this one, testing out new concepts. We also foster P3 partnerships, conduct applied research to understand what really works, and we work very closely with the Federal Transit Administration as well as the Air Resources Board in California. So today we're going to discuss the RideCo partnership with LA Metro and the creation of the Metro Micro. And as all of you I know, this last year, of course, has been very difficult and really devastating in many ways, but it has also fostered innovation. And one of the things that has kind of come to the fore is on-demand transit, because it's been embraced by many agencies as a particularly good way to respond to many of the uncertainties in mobility currently. On-demand transit can be flexible, it can respond to changing demand, it can work well in a number of different geographies as a first last mile solution, as for full trips, and also for paratransit and delivery services. But none of these things just work by themselves. These, to get it right and to make it actually successful, requires working well with customers, with companies, with the public sector, and from our perspective, really engaging the community to understand the needs. It also means getting the technical part right and the marketing well done. So we're going to have a discussion about how LA Metro moved from piloting and planning these concepts over a number of years and has now created the Metro Micro as an integral part of the transit services provided by LA Metro. So specifically, we're gonna kind of dig in on what was involved in planning the Metro Micro, with the idea of it being at a very large scale, perhaps the largest in the world is the ambition, and how this model is different from other models, and what the benefits are of establishing strong public-private partnerships. And we're also going to look at success factors. And so how do you measure the impact and figure out if this really is fulfilling its goals? So we're going to talk to two people who know this well. We're going to talk to Rani, Narula-Woods, and she is the project director at LA Metro, who is running this program. And she is literally in the middle of implementation. When we had a practice, she had to go check on things that were happening on the ground right at that moment. And she's also been involved in this project really since its conception. And then we're also going to talk to Prem Gururajan, and he is the CEO of RideCo, and they are the project partner for this. So we're going to hear from the people who know best what is going on with this. So let's dig in and get started with Rani. And so, Rani, why don't you just get us started with giving us the basics, like what is this project, Metro Micro, and how does it work?
Definitely. Well, thank you, Sharon. It has definitely been a journey with lots of ups and downs and starts and stops with this project. I joined the agency about 4 years ago, and in that stage, we had received an unsolicited proposal, essentially to be able to fast track a procurement to test on-demand technology. And luckily, that kept moving through the process and ultimately has led us to the service Metro Micro. And the concept at hand, I think, at least from our Office of Extraordinary Innovation, when we were thinking through this concept was, could we test out a new public-private partnership model where the public sector could bring to the table the things that we know best about operations, managing employees, and kind of making sure that everything is running just safely on the street, and match it with really the best of the private sector. And so that's what we were looking at, was really the know-how on the technology, on the customer experience, and ultimately being able to be flexible and quick in a way that sometimes, as a government agency, we struggle with. And so that was the goal and the intent at the beginning. The procurement model is a really unique one, and we can come back to it later. It is a pre-development agreement, PDA P3. And what that really just means is that it gave us enough flexibility to be able to work through concept and design with partners to ultimately get to what I believe is a very strong partnership between LA Metro and RideCo. And so to get into the service model, I wanted to actually just share a quick video, one of our advertising tools. And so Brent, if you wouldn't mind playing that.
All right.
So Sharon, maybe I can just build off that real quick. So hopefully that gave everyone a good and solid sense of kind of what the service looks like, and hopefully the customer experience that we're achieving with the new offering. Right now, we've been in operations for about 5 weeks, and so far so good. We just completed 1,000 rides. So first micro milestone, check. And so with the service, what we're seeing is really, it is a significant number of repeat customers. And I think that that's one of the critical KPIs. We'll talk about those later. All in all, the service itself, when fully deployed, which will be in September, will have 9 zones across the county of LA. Just as a point of reference, here in California, we have about 40 million people, 10 million of which live here in the county of Los Angeles. So hopefully we will have a lot of people to serve and help move as a result of this project.
Wow. And you have to kind of, move around when you're getting on the service because with the music in the background. So.
Yeah, we try to keep it fun. That's the goal with transit, right?
Right. So, so Prem, let's hear from you about RideCo and what were your motivations in getting involved in this, and anything else you want to add about the description of the service?
Sure, thanks for that, Sharon. So I'm Prem, as Sharon introduced me. I've actually been working on this project right from day one through the planning phases. It's been a year and a half, or almost two now. And it's been actually great to work with Rani throughout that process. I feel like I agree. It's been a long journey, Rani, but it's exciting to see it finally hit the ground and come live. And, other than the obvious reasons why this is an exciting project at scale, it's Los Angeles County. I think one of the exciting things for us has been the team we're working with, the team of extraordinary innovation, as they call themselves. They've been very flexible, very forward-thinking in designing this project, in working with us as partners. And so I think that's number one. It is a relatively new technology for the world of transit, and it's growing really fast. So having an innovative and flexible mindset is important, I think, from everyone's side. I think the other thing that's really exciting for us is the scale of the project. At about 100 vehicles, it's the largest public microtransit service nationally, and also the operational goals. We're really looking at something that's not just a pilot, but something that we can operationalize. And so there's a whole host of KPIs and targets that we're looking to achieve with the service, which I will touch on later on. But I think the team, the scale, the ambition, the operational goals all make it a very exciting project for us at RideCo.
And as part of that, maybe you could share some insights you've gained as you've gone through it. I'm sure you had some ideas when you started, and just how they've evolved as it's gone along, and particularly in the as it perhaps changed the goals or influenced the goals that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've worked with Metro's team for about a year to almost a year and a half during the planning and analysis phase. And during that time, first off, we had the privilege of meeting and spending time with, I would say, over 100 people at Metro, from planning and analysis all the way to vehicle operations and safety. And as part of that journey, we obviously analyzed lots of data. We looked at all the regions and zones around LA County using dozens of metrics: population density, employment density, transit access, equity, and so on. But with the interest of time, I'd like us to focus on two very insightful findings that we got from all this analysis. And one insight relates to the user experience, and the other one relates to operations and cost. And these two insights really stood out in a big way that I'd like to share with everyone here. So on the user experience side, there's a metric that that Metro really focused on, amongst other things, but it was called travel time competitiveness. Metro, through its Next Gen project, had access to a lot of data. And they had this data trove of millions of origin destination pairs and their travel time ratio. So let me explain what that means. So travel time ratio basically looks at a certain origin destination pair, and it calculates the travel time by the total journey time by transit, including waiting, walking, and transfers all put together, and divide that by journey time by personal car for that same origin destination pair. And Metro had access to this data for millions of data points. So as an example, if the travel time ratio is 1, it means that it takes the same time to get between those two times, between those 2 points, by transit as it does by personal car. And when you plot all these data points and segment them, you see that travel time ratio or the journey time is a key predictor of people adopting transit. So, for example, when the travel time ratio is less than 1.5, you'll see that the market share held by public transit is very healthy. It's over 10%. That's really good market share. But when the travel time ratio goes up to 2.5 or more, meaning it takes 2.5 times longer to take the same journey by transit relative to a personal car, that transit market share plummets down to less than 3%. So the key insight here was that the total journey time is really a key factor to bringing more riders and attracting them to transit. That was one of the big user experience insights. If you go to the next slide, Brent, I'd like to talk about really key operational insight from all the analysis that we did. So this here on the right is a picture of Metro's bus network utilization. And all the lines that you see are actually Metro's bus lines. And they're color-coded based on the productivity. And so the green lines are highly productive. That means they move more than 30 passengers per vehicle revenue hour. The orange and red lines have low productivity, meaning they move less than 30, or in the case of the red ones, less than 20 passengers per vehicle revenue hour. It's also worth noting that a lot of these low productivity lines also have low quality, meaning their frequency is worse than 20 minutely. And they tend to have significant first last mile access gaps. So one of the big conclusions that came out of this analysis is actually summarized in this report to the board by the Chief Operating Officer of Metro. And I have that in quotes. It's basically to evaluate areas with underperforming line segments for either restructuring or replacement with other modes or elimination. And that's where microtransit really fits into the network, and it's a candidate for the replacement. And microtransit can come in and help fill in the gaps where these underperforming lines are and may be eliminated potentially. And in turn, it can actually turn the region into a high quality transit zone and become a complement to the high performing routes and drive more users into the high quality lines of the network. So those were some really key data points that we analyzed. And when we look at this in totality, we kind of put together a mandate for microtransit. And it really boils down to this. Number one, we want to bring more ridership to transit. And we achieve that tactically by reducing the total journey time, as we saw with the travel time competitiveness metric. And we have to do that in a multimodal fashion, so that we can drive more people to the commuter bus or to rail to give them options to bypass congestion. And the flip side of it is, while we're going to make it a great user experience, it has to be operationally viable and sustainable for Metro. Particularly, Metro is operating the service with employee operators. So there are certain factors and rules and regulations that go with that. And because of the cost model, it needs to have a sustainable productivity. So those are the two key high-level mandates that we established for Micro as a result of all this planning that we did.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, so those are definitely worthy goals to reduce the journey time, improve the experience, and also make it work with employee operators. So we're going to dig into a little more later about how that gets measured and just how that's going. But I think we should explore some more about the operations. So Rani, can you talk about the zones that you chose? So you had these insights and then you picked specific zones, and what were the considerations from LA Metro going into this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks, Sharon. As I mentioned, we're a county of 10 million, which means we have many, many different communities within our community. And so with that, we really wanted to better understand from the data points that Prem had spoke to as a result of our next gen study, where were the markets that we weren't covering with public transit? And that was kind of a driving question for us, was where here in this county of Los Angeles do you have trips that people are driving alone, maybe because they do have access to a car, or secondly, they might be driving alone within a transportation network company. That's what we call them here in California. So the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. And so those were sort of our early questions. And as we went through this process, we tried to understand, are there certain types of trips that someone who is a transit user today would be willing to take on transit if it was a journey time that was reasonable? That was kind of the question. And so when we thought about it, one of the key markets that we saw an opportunity in was connection to schools. Now, certainly with our bus system, we have trippers and we get people to and from school every day, but there's a lot more trips that people take getting to school, to and from, recreational trips after school, drop off from the parents, that you have to consider in the whole mix of getting people out of the house and eventually back into the house. And so as we thought through that, we wanted to really test out not only the more common kind of school trips for elementary school kids, but really think about elementary school kids, junior high, recreational trips, trips to after school activities, as well as college students. So when we looked across these 6 areas, we found a few places that had public institutions and private institutions that we wanted to serve. And then in the case of Watts Willowbrook, which was our first zone to launch, in that area alone, we had 40 schools. Now, given that it's COVID, it hasn't played out the way that we had thought things would play out, but it still remains a very important use case because that also has an important linkage and tie into our public policy goals from the public sector. Because as we think about access to opportunity, access to jobs, and access to upward mobility, kind of taking those parents out of that role where they had to be the provider to get them to and from school or to and from recreational trips gives them more flexibility. And ultimately, we think will bring other improvements to the community. So in each of these zones, we were really thinking about not only how do you get to and from your destination, but what are the longer term impacts for each of the communities with which we come into. And so that's just one example. Some of the other scenarios that we used for picking zones, we were looking at the challenges of shift workers, especially those that work at LAX. Sometimes our buses just don't run with enough frequency, or frankly, it doesn't feel safe enough to take a bus at some times of day. So we thought that was an important destination and an important use case as well. Medical institutions, and kind of in that vein of essential trips, also continued to come to the forefront throughout, I think, almost every zone that we selected.
Wow. That's good. I mean, and this is such a challenging moment to think through all this because the trip patterns have changed and probably will continue to change, with COVID and post-COVID and all the thoughts about, what people's commutes will look like in the future. So anyway, that's really interesting. Now, in these zones that you have established, one of the things I'm sure people are wondering about is how does this really work? Like, what are their bus stops and then their virtual stops? And so how does one know how to access the service, and how does that work?
Sure, I can elaborate a bit more on that model.
Okay.
It's a great question. So I'd like to illustrate the concept of how we've incorporated virtual stops and bus stops using one of our zones, so people can visualize what's going on. So the Watts Willowbrook zone is one of the zones we just launched. It's live, and the zone has about 110,000 residents and jobs. It has 4 train stations and also several medical centers. And if you look at the next slide, Brent, here you'll see we've plotted the bus lines that go through the region, the metro bus lines. And they're great. They connect the train stations, they connect the key points of interest. But at the same time, you'll notice there are first and last mile gaps. If you happen to live and work along these bus lines, you have great service. But if you want to connect into them and you're not within a walking distance, then you have a first last mile access gap. And here's where the virtual stops get layered on. So on the next slide, you'll see all the purple dots. So
Wow.
those are a combination of bus stops and virtual stops. And riders can use the app or call by telephone, and they can book rides between any virtual stops in the zone without a transfer. And it's important to note that the virtual stops are predetermined, and they are vetted in person for safety and accessibilities. Some member of RideCo staff and Metro's operations staff actually go and vet every stop to make sure that it's well lit, that people feel safe getting there. And so it's not just a street corner that may not be very accessible. And so they're very easy to get to. They're all pretty much, if you live in the zone, you're within a 5-minute walk of a virtual stop. And you have virtual stop at all the key points of interest, like Rani mentioned, with schools, with the hospitals, and so on. The virtual stops are vetted and predetermined, but at the same time, they also offer flexibility in that they can be added, removed, or changed based on the needs of the community. So for example, if feedback from riders show that we should be adding a virtual stop near a certain location, or if just the analyzing the trip request data shows a hotspot and we need to add a virtual stop there, we can do that. So it allows a certain level of being dynamic while at the same time offering the safety that people come to expect from a public transit service.
And I assume that the driver is knowing in real time where people are, and then skipping the places that they don't need to stop at. Is that right?
Yes, the system is dynamic.
Yeah.
In the sense that drivers are only going to stops where a ride is requested. So they're not just driving around for no reason if there are no riders. It's demand responsive.
Yeah.
And it's really just kind of to add there, I was just out in the field, as you mentioned, Sharon, with our operators, try to spend a good amount of time with them since it's a brand new workforce here at Metro. I think it's really easy. It's really simple. And I think from the public sector side, it gives us a lot of confidence, especially on the safety piece. Just that, it is that dynamic. It is very clear and explicit what they need to do next. That vetting that's done on the front end of the stops also gives us, I think, that assurity that not only are, the vehicles and the people in the vehicles going to be safe, but also the pedestrians. So that's really kind of a critical part of the service design.
Well, yeah, that's great. So what other ways, I know you've all said this is different than other micro transit solutions that are going on in other places, and maybe you could talk about some of the unique features and things that you really think make a difference.
Sure.
Yeah,
I would,
what you've already explained, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and Prem, feel welcome to jump in as usual. I would say that, I would say that a big piece of this is just the level of partnership between us, between RideCo and LA Metro, is that it really takes kind of both sides stepping in, and sometimes we're covering each other's roles and responsibilities, because that's what we need to do to achieve project success. And so for us, I did mention, the public sector, we come with certain expertise, as does the private sector, but there's also just a lot of really important learning between each partner. We were, from the front end and from the start of the project, we were really confident that there wasn't going to be a perfect solution out there for our needs, that we really needed something that could be tailored and something that could iterate once we had a service on the street. And so I feel really validated that it was the right model in terms of being able to really kind of be in the driving seat together, rather than having necessarily us call the shots or have the private sector take on that position. So that, to me, that was one of the key elements of the service design. But go ahead, Prem.
Yeah, and I know one of you, I would like you to talk about the model of using in-house using drivers that are, I think that's part of your different model also, right?
Definitely. But Prem, did you want to answer any more of just like the unique components of the project design before we talk about the drivers?
So the driver model, and I can talk about the use cases right after.
Okay, sounds good. So for the driver model, that was also a unique element that certainly has had a huge impact on our costs. I've seen a few text messages on that so far today. The cost piece was a really challenging one for us as an agency, and has become only more challenging during the pandemic. We've been really fortunate in that we see this as part of our operations. And so the money that we're spending on this service is coming from operations eligible funds. So it means that every dollar is very, very valuable to the agency, and we have to be very mindful and judicious in terms of spending it. But I think beyond, just the ridership and the improvement in customer experience, it's also an investment for Metro in terms of the workforce. So for us, we have five labor unions that we work with in terms of our agency. And in the case of our operators, we have a union, Smart TD, that's our exclusive operating union. And so the new workforce, which is still relatively small, has all come on with Smart TD. And we've done that through a side letter to our collective bargaining agreement, which I think has been more necessary than ever to have that level of flexibility, especially during COVID.
Yeah. And Prem, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Brent, if you could turn on the slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about what's unique about micro from both an end user perspective and, as Rani spoke about, from the operator perspective, because there are unique elements on both sides. And from an end user perspective, I think what's unique about the services we've throughout the planning phase, we analyzed and considered a lot of different ways in which people may want to use the service and built that into the offering. And I would say it's probably the most diverse offering in terms of use cases supported. So for example, there's a lot of booking flexibility. You can book a ride on demand, last minute, or you can pre-schedule your ride, or you can book a recurring trip. And if you kind of think about how that plays out in terms of use cases, for example, if you can think of a scenario where a parent, right, dropping off his child at school, going to an appointment, and then maybe stopping at the grocery store before he returns home, that's a kind of a trip chaining type use case. So that's where on-demand type of booking comes into play. But then you may have a senior citizen that wants to schedule an appointment, a medical appointment or a social appointment with a very specific drop-off time. They need to get to a certain location by a certain time, and they need to pre-schedule that with the guaranteed pickup and drop-off time. Or think of a commuter who needs a recurring daily ride at a set pickup and a set drop-off time every day. They could be taking a connection to transit. They may be taking a commuter bus into the core or taking rail. So I think that's a scenario, or they want to get to work at a certain time. So the system and the app supports all those use cases. You can make all those different types of ride bookings. Each and every ride, you'll notice here in the on the screenshot, the one in the center, you'll notice that it's got these trip options, and each option has a designated pickup time and a latest arrive before time. And this guaranteed drop-off time is really important because it helps make sure that you get to your connecting transit bus or get to work on time. And it's really important for predictable commuting. So that kind of guaranteed pickup, guaranteed drop-off time is something that's a pretty important use case. And finally, I think we're serving different user groups. It's very bike friendly, it's family friendly, obviously it's accessible. So I can basically take my bike, book a ride, and then put my bike on the bike rack, and then get off, and then I can bike the last little bit to work if I need to. So we've kind of thought through all the different user segments and user groups. So I think it's probably the most diverse that I'm aware of that supports these models. And then on the next slide, I'd like to just speak briefly about our integration for multimodal. Multimodal is an important part of the microservice. It's not just micro, you're not just getting on micro and getting off micro. Often you'll be getting off micro to take a bus that goes to a different zone. A lot of the zones we're launching in, people that live there, they work in other zones or other areas. So taking connecting bus is important. And also driving more ridership to that backbone of transit. The rail and interconnecting buses between zones is important for the service. So we've integrated with the Transit app, which is Metro's multimodal app provider. So the integration is actually pretty exciting. It's going live in the next few weeks, and it'll allow a rider to search for rides and take trips that combine microtransit with fixed route transit all across the county. So that's So those are some important and unique things about the user side. I'll talk a bit about the operator side. And this is kind of an aspect that often is not talked about, but is actually quite important to have a successful microtransit operation. For one, we have larger format vehicles. They're not sedans. We have transit vehicles. You can have 6 to 8 passengers in them. And they're also employee drivers. So what that means is the cost model and the vehicle format requires us to have a higher productivity to make the service more cost effective to operate. So we're targeting between 5 to 10 passengers per vehicle revenue hour, depending on the zone. We're obviously aiming for the higher end to reach 10 at full scale, but that's kind of the realm of sustainability and scalability for the service. And that's a higher target than many other microtransit services nationally. The other side of it actually speaks a bit more to the unions and the rules and regulations around having employee drivers. And the technology and the way it's set up must handle the nuances of all the employee rules. For example, employees must must get about a 30-minute break, meal break, if they work for more than 5 hours. And they're entitled to, say, 15-minute breaks every 3 or 4 hours. And the rules will vary from union to union and location to location. But with these rules and a dynamic system, there are a lot of little nuances. For example, you don't want all drivers to be taking breaks at the same time. Or let's say you don't want them to be taking breaks when there's a lot of trip demand. So the break assignment needs to be a little bit flexible, and the system needs to be intelligent to factor that in. And so the way we've set it up for micro, the system assigns breaks to drivers automatically and intelligently based on whether there's a ride about to happen, based on trip demand. As an example, a driver's break may get moved earlier by 20 minutes or later by 20 minutes or more, depending on if there's some, let's say, a last minute ride request and if there's a surge of demand. While obviously those kind of dynamic assignments have to be done while respecting the union rules and the regulations surrounding breaks and so on. So those are some operational differences that factor into what's unique about the Metro microservice.
And have you done that anywhere else, or is this like the first of doing that?
I think some of the factors like the use case support, having bike racks in combination with other things, that's pretty unique in the diversity. And that goes to Metro's team's vision on how they see very inclusive service.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been great. And I think some of the features like the automated driver brakes, it's definitely relatively unique, and it's really tuned to all the nuances of the employee operator model.
Yeah, that's great. So, and I guess it's also new. So, I mean, so far, is this, this dynamic approach working? Is there anything you can say about that?
Go ahead, Rani. You were about to.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think it is working. It's almost like we're gonna get our own A/B testing opportunity just because of the moment we're living through right now, right? In January of 2021, and what this will look like in a year from now. I would say overall, from an agency standpoint, the customers are very, very happy with the level of customization, frankly, that they get to have as part of the public service offering and a public sector offering. So I think we're definitely winning on that front. And I would say in terms of retention for our drivers, it's really hard to work on the front line. I'm out there with them and I see them, and it's certainly not an easy job to have. And it's quite a thing to take that on at the time they're taking it on. So I think that these elements and kind of the enhanced safety, the reliability, the real-time information, all of those I think provide also the drivers more certainty than they might have in a larger vehicle or with less data and less information and people being pre-booked with accounts. There's a enhanced level of safety and comfort, I think, with this operation.
Yeah. So maybe that ties in with discussing a little bit more about the partnership model and kind of what flexibility that provided. And sort of what key partnerships, this is to you really, Prem, you know, have you leveraged to support this type of deployment? So that, because there's a lot of different components going on here at the same time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to speak briefly. And you know, I think in overall, on the overall, this project would not be possible without the support of our partners. You know, RideCo provides the technology and overall project management, but we really rely on our partners for aspects like marketing, fleet operations, multimodal integrations. So yeah, I want to give a big thanks to all of our partners on this project. You know, some of them are live now and working with us. Some will be in the upcoming zones. But I think making this a collaborative effort has been helpful, and it's definitely been exciting for us.
Great. And we're going to get to the Q&A for those of you who've been putting it in the Q&A box. But I just wanted to have you speak a little bit to the KPIs and how you're evaluating, you know, the performance, how you're monitoring it and how you're going to evaluate it. So I guess, Rani, if you could speak to that first, and then Prem, and how this kind of evaluation, you know, you said a little bit, there are some things that are very different from what you've done, but you could comment on, you know, how you're able to do this. Or
Yeah, definitely. And I know we want to get to questions as well. So I'll be relatively brief here. I would say, you know, some of the KPIs that you see listed here are really consistent with what we think about for bus and rail. You know, certainly we're always focused on ridership. We want on-time performance. You know, we need to make sure certain things happen. And finances is definitely on the top of the list there too. I would say just a few kind of unique elements for this operation. One, which I mentioned before, is kind of the workforce investment. We are looking at retention. As I said before, it's really difficult to be on the front line and to stay on the front line. So that is something that's very important. And it is part of that also thinking about discipline differently than kind of our traditional mindset between management and the workforce. So that's been a critical part of the service design. And then I would say also just the connectivity piece is the other one I would highlight, is that the service itself is not just about who takes micro, but it's about how it ultimately improves and enhances the network, not only what Metro operates, but what our partners locally and regionally operate too, as to avoid kind of cannibalizing any other mode in particular bus. So I would just wanted to kind of highlight those two in terms of immediate KPIs that we're thinking about.
okay. Well, I think maybe we should get to these questions, and maybe Prem, you could talk more about KPIs as we go through some of these questions. But the first thing on here is about marketing. And we know that how it's marketed, you know, you've got these ambitious goals in terms of filling up the vehicles. And I'm, you know, understand that that's key to making this all work, and meeting that KPI in terms of the financial part of it. So maybe you could talk about, someone asked what marketing methods have worked best so far, and, you know, maybe in LA and maybe from your other experience as well, Prem, you know, and why do you think they've worked?
I can speak to it briefly. So we are relatively in the early days. So a lot of the marketing campaigns are happening as we speak. And interestingly, the pandemic has necessitated the need to pivot our marketing approaches, because many of the techniques that were initially planned, like street teams and, you know, a lot of saturation and in-person saturation is not viable with the pandemic going on. But some of the ones that are the campaigns that are working really well right now are we're getting great conversion rates on social media campaigns, specifically with some of our we've basically done small video clips and We've used them on Facebook, for example, one of the channels. So we're seeing fantastic conversion rates on those. I think we'll have more information on this as time goes on to see in the big picture which one produced the most. But right now, our video campaigns on Facebook seem to be working quite well. And then one of the techniques that has built awareness is, and we're actually ramping this up as well, is actually advertising through the existing bus routes. We spoke about how some routes are being discontinued. So we actually got quite a decent amount of initial ridership by advertising to those riders that were going to be affected by those bus routes that were being discontinued and replaced with micro.
Mhm. And so that I think ties into one of the other questions is about the demographics. And is this for what's known as choice riders, or is this a broader demographic? And certainly how you market and reach people, it depends on that as well. So I don't know, Rani, did you want to speak to how?
Yeah, sure. That was definitely a question from the start, was kind of what bucket are you targeting? Are you targeting kind of retention for current riders, or are you looking at market share and opportunities for new riders? And for us, we made a really intentional decision that it was about both, that we needed a service that was about anybody that would ride, because we saw the future as being inherently multimodal. So it wasn't something where someone was just going to choose one mode and stick with it, but we wanted people to kind of put this into their mobility wallet, right? And for this to be just one option of many options that they would have available. So that's been kind of critical in our thinking, and that ties back to the price point as well. The service itself is $1 a trip. So clearly we are nowhere near a profitable operation, but it does allow anyone to have access to the service, which is ultimately what we want to get at in terms of the public sector.
Okay. Yeah, and that is one of the questions actually, like, is the dollar just a introductory rate, and then there's some other fare coming down the pike? And just how is that going to enhance service? And I know LA Metro is going through its own discussions about what the fare actually should be in general. So, maybe you can comment on how this all fits with that.
Yeah, it definitely is an interesting moment. We have been exploring going free for public transit, for bus and rail. And so it is kind of an odd time to be launching a revenue service during that discussion. That being said, we kind of have to see how this shakes out. At a maximum, we had anticipated that we would go, at least a few months ago, up to $2.50 a trip. The $2.50 price point, however, would include a transfer. And the transfer right now for bus and rail, it's $1.75. So when you think about it, there's actually a cost savings, and you actually reduce your cost of riding micro to 75 cents. So there's just some things we have to consider, and some, I think, big policy decisions really for our board to make.
Okay. And then this is, I think, a more technical question, but since it comes from Alvaro at the Shared Use Mobility Center, I thought I'd put it to you. The travel time ratio looks like he's commenting on that it's very interesting, but wondering about the variability of those ratios over different times of day. And if you analyze that to, when you were thinking about the potential market share in different zones. So if you were looking across, from, 24-hour day or whatever number of hours the service is operating, 12 hours.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the data was sliced and diced along different dimensions by location, origin, destination, how long the trip was. So if it's like a long distance trip, or if it's a medium or short distance trip. And the overall findings that transit market share is higher when that ratio is lower, held across those different segments. Off the top of my mind, I can't remember what the exact numbers were for each scenario. But the general trend was the same, whether it was for long, short, or certain times of day.
Okay. And then I guess some basic operational things about what kind of vehicles are being used, how many are in each zone, you know, what's the seating capacity, how big are the zones? You know, can you explain a little more about that? And,
Yeah, I
and
can.
what the plan is for that too.
So I can jump in kind of on the cars, and then Prem, maybe if you can jump in on the specifics on the zones. So for the cars, we wanted to really kind of go out with a mixed fleet because we weren't confident that there's a single microtransit vehicle that necessarily fit our needs. So we actually went with a leased model with 5 different vehicles. So that includes a Ford Transit 150, a Ford Transit 350, the Mercedes Metris, the Mercedes Sprinter, and the Dodge Grand Caravan. And so that allowed us to achieve our accessibility goals, not only to have the conversion for 1 wheelchair, but for 2, because often people in wheelchairs like to travel in pairs. So that was a critical component for us, but also to have the flexibility in the seating where if we needed to go up to 15 people, we could, but for ease of use, we would likely only configure the cars for 10. And now in COVID, we also have, temporary social distancing placards that lead us to only filling the vehicles to 50% occupancy. So those are some of the kind of the short-term steps that we've taken. Our initial set of vehicles is only about 20 plus today. But I would say, we definitely anticipate as the vaccine rolls out that we'll see the growth in terms of drawing down from that lease.
Yeah. And didn't you had said previously, like the goal was it 100 vehicles or?
110 is the anticipated fleet for the pilot.
Okay. And someone on here asked about the software. Is that who does operating it? Who does it belong to? Is that RideCo or Metro?
Go ahead, Prem.
Yeah, so just to complete the last question about zone sizes. So the zones varied in size, but basically they were between 15 to 20 square miles per zone in that range. In one of the zones, there's a huge airport, so the actual serviceable area is maybe more like 10 square miles. And then to your question about software, so RideCo is the creator and provider of the software technology. Obviously, Metro licenses the software, and there's a lot of configuration and customization and branding for Micro and Metro that happens. But the underlying technology is provided by RideCo.
And just to kind of add to that, the data though, because I know for the public sector, this is always a big question. The data, however, accessed by RideCo is owned by LA Metro.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you have certain protocols about the data provision and how you're sharing that information, I assume.
Definitely, and in part not only because of national and international law and privacy policies, but also those that continue to evolve here in California.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then well, I guess there, you've talked about a little bit about what you're charging, but sort of how do you see that financially in terms of when you compare it to the fixed routes that you're operating? There are a lot of questions in here about, how does this actually work? Like, where do you get the money? None of these things ever pay for themselves. I think anyone with any experience in transit knows that. So the question is really like, how are you doing that calculation? And how does it compare to the expenses that LA Metro has with its trains and buses or whatever it's potentially replacing or reducing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say the finance office does ask me that question every day. So it is a very popular topic here in our agency, spending money on a pilot in a pandemic. But I would say, you know, for us, we kind of have to really get back at, you know, what are those KPIs? What are we thinking about in terms of success when we consider overall, you know, annual operating budget? And what is kind of the short-term win and what is the long-term win? The short term is that, you know, customers are happy and they're getting where they need to get. The long-term win is that, you know, the public sector is well positioned for a future that is in serious flux. And so for us, I think the finances are a key part. We kind of knew at the front end that there was going to be a level of investment that we had to put in. We didn't use kind of our older vehicles and repurpose them. We didn't use our current operators and restructure them. We really kind of went in and said, there's going to be a certain level of investment. This is its own small startup in a large agency. And with that, we don't expect cost recovery to be on day one. So I think what we'll see in the next 6 to 12 months as we see where ridership is just that initial evaluation of how much is this costing? What are those KPIs? Are we achieving those, you know, those benchmarks that we need to? And then for us with the bus, I mean, it's about $200 plus per revenue service hour fully loaded. So I think, you know, that's the ceiling. we can't be anywhere near that. But as far as how we get to, you know, somewhere between the ceiling and the ground, I think that's going to be a lot of strategy and a lot of iterating throughout the process.
I can add a note to that as well, if that's okay.
Sure.
Thanks for that clarification, Rani. And from the planning and analysis phase, we actually spent a lot of time on this specific question with Rani and her team and set the targets and what the operating model would look like once we're at full scale and ridership. But, you know, if you want to use a simple rule of thumb, the operating cost of this, based on what Rani mentioned, we're looking at between, I would say 35 to 50% is what the recurring operating cost of this would be relative to the fixed route, between 35 to 50%. So there's some savings right there. On the productivity side, which drives the cost per passenger number, one of the slides we had, we talked about 5 to 10 passengers per vehicle revenue hour. So when you combine the two, the 35 to 50% of the standard bus combined with the 5 to 10 passengers per vehicle revenue hour, it may being in that range basically makes it a more sustainable service in those areas that the zones that we're looking at. Now, obviously, those numbers for the operating cost and the productivity target will vary by agency, and even within an agency, the zone you're looking at. But that should give hopefully people an approximate guideline.
And I just wanted to let you two know that there are a few people who are saying like, this is awesome, this is an amazing, and you know, they all want to see those KPIs and see how it works. I think though we do have time for a couple more questions. One of them is really about how can other municipalities best begin this planning process? Like there's so much to this, and so you know, how can they be ready? Like I think some people are rightfully hopeful that there may be some resources, more resources available with the new administration and new opportunities to try these kind of programs. But like, how do you really prepare for it if your region hasn't done this?
I think I would just say probably is, you know, going to webinars like this is a good start. I feel really fortunate. We have a number of friends at other jurisdictions throughout the country, KCETA, AC Transit and such, that have been really helpful in kind of the early days, the challenges and the opportunities. So I think going to peers is definitely useful. I'd say I have a handful of calls every week with different jurisdictions that are interested in this space, just to kind of talk about the model, how their approach may differ. And so I think at LA Metro, just given the level of investment that we've put into this mode with the largest contract in the country for an on-demand service, we're more than glad to make ourselves available just to kind of share what we've learned. And then, you're welcome to, apply what you will. I will say our RFP I've seen reposted in some other jurisdictions, and, we're totally good with it.
And Prem, do you want to add anything to that?
I know, I would just echo what Rani said. I think their team, having spent a year and a half on the analysis, have become experts in analyzing this 100 different ways. So I definitely, their team's a great resource. But RideCo, we also offer services for planning and analyzing your transit network and helping you figure out where microtransit fits in. So we're also, as a company, RideCo, we're also happy to support agencies in that effort.
Okay. Well, I think we are out of time. And so I don't want to keep going here, but I want to thank everybody for participating in this discussion. And I think everyone is, or at least I am, I'm rooting for you to make this this work. And from our experience at the Shared Use Mobility Center, these programs, they take iteration, they take being on the ground, looking at the data, and really exhibiting that flexibility to change. And I think that's another thing in this terrible pandemic time, that agencies have shown an ability to have that flexibility and to be able to move more quickly. And the private sector, has in a lot of cases been pretty good at that, even before the pandemic. So I think that's what we take with us as a very hopeful point in time for testing and growing these kinds of innovations to further the goal of providing really good mobility for all in a environmentally and cost-effective way. And with that, we're gonna close out. You've got all our names there. Everybody is happy to talk with you. And yeah, there is a recording at that address there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you, Rani. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you
Thanks
again,
again.
everyone. And if your question didn't get answered, we'll be sure to follow up soon with an answer for that.